Rain hammered against the tall glass windows of the Manhattan penthouse, the sound steady and relentless, like a drumbeat echoing through the silent rooms. Lightning flashed briefly across the skyline, illuminating the city in pale white light before darkness swallowed it again. Isabella Rossi stood alone in the kitchen, barefoot on the cold marble floor, staring at the small white object in her trembling hands. 2 pink lines. They looked so simple, so quiet, yet they had just changed everything. For a long moment, she did not move. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished stone countertop, pale and stunned, dark hair falling loosely over her shoulders. Her hand slowly drifted to her stomach, pressing lightly against the flat fabric of her dress. A baby, their baby. For years, she had imagined this moment. She had pictured Alessandro lifting her off the floor in excitement, his dark eyes filled with pride, his powerful arms wrapped around her as they laughed about the future. But those memories belonged to a different man. The Alessandro she had married 3 years ago had been intense, mysterious, powerful, but still human. He had taken her to quiet restaurants at midnight after long meetings. He had brushed her hair away from her face when she fell asleep beside him. He had once whispered that one day they would have a house filled with children. But power changes people. And Don Alessandro Moretti had become something else entirely. The clock on the wall ticked quietly. 11:17 p.m. He was late again. Another council meeting with the syndicate leaders. Another night negotiating territory, alliances, power. Outside, thunder rolled across the city. The sound of the penthouse door unlocking echoed through the apartment. Isabella's heart jumped. Heavy footsteps crossed the marble floor of the hallway. Alessandro entered the kitchen moments later, removing his black coat as he walked. Rain dotted his dark hair, and the expensive suit he wore looked as sharp and controlled as the man inside it. He smelled faintly of rain, whiskey, and the cold metallic scent that always seemed to follow him home from meetings. His presence filled the room instantly. Don Alessandro Moretti did not simply enter spaces, he dominated them. He glanced briefly toward Isabella, but continued loosening his tie as he walked to the bar. "You're still awake," he said casually, pouring himself a glass of bourbon. His voice carried the same calm authority he used with soldiers and businessmen alike. Isabella watched him silently. For a moment, she wondered if she should wait until morning. But the test was still warm in her hand, and the future inside her could not wait. "We need to talk," she said softly. Alessandro took a slow sip of his drink, leaning one hand against the marble counter. "Can it wait?" he asked. The council meeting ran longer than expected. "I have another negotiation tomorrow morning." The casual dismissal struck her like a quiet slap. "No," she said. Something in her tone made him pause. He turned to face her fully now, studying her expression with narrowed eyes. "What is it?" Isabella swallowed. Her fingers tightened around the small plastic test before she placed it carefully on the counter between them. "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air. For a brief moment, Alessandro did not move. The glass in his hand froze halfway to his lips. Then slowly, almost mechanically, he lowered it onto the counter. His eyes moved from Isabella to the pregnancy test. 2 pink lines. Silence filled the room, but it was not the warm silence she had imagined. It was cold, calculating, dangerous. "How far along?" he asked finally. His voice was calm, too calm. 6 weeks. Alessandro ran a hand slowly through his dark hair and turned away from her. walking toward the tall windows overlooking the city. Lightning flashed again outside. For several seconds he said nothing. Isabella waited. Her heart beat harder with every second. Finally he spoke. "We can't have a child right now." The words landed with quiet finality. Isabella blinked. "What?" He turned back toward her, his expression composed, his mind clearly already calculating the problem. "You know how things are right now," he said. "The alliance with the Romano family is unstable. The Chicago organization is watching our territory. If word spreads that I have an heir on the way, every rival in the country will see it as leverage." Isabella stared at him. He continued speaking as if explaining a business strategy. "In this world, family is vulnerability. A child becomes a target. A weakness enemies can exploit." Her stomach tightened. "This isn't a business deal," she whispered. "It is exactly that," Alessandro replied. His eyes hardened slightly. "We are at war more often than you realize. The timing of this is unacceptable." The word unacceptable echoed painfully in her chest. "This is our baby," she said. "It is a liability." The coldness of the answer stole the breath from her lungs. For the first time that night she truly looked at him. At the man standing across the kitchen from her. The powerful Mafia boss. The feared leader. And suddenly she could not find the man she had once loved. "What are you saying?" she asked quietly. Alessandro met her gaze directly. "You need to terminate the pregnancy." The words felt like a knife sliding slowly into her chest. Isabella's hand moved protectively to her stomach. "You want me to kill our child?" "I want you to be practical," he replied. His tone carried the same firm authority he used during negotiations. "We can have children later, when the situation is stable, when it doesn't threaten everything we've built." Everything we've built. The phrase echoed bitterly in her mind. Tears burned behind her eyes. "And if I don't?" Alessandro did not hesitate. "If you choose to keep the child," he said calmly, "then this marriage cannot continue." The room felt suddenly smaller. The rain outside grew louder. "You're giving me a choice," she whispered. "Yes." His voice carried no hesitation. "The baby or the marriage." For several seconds Isabella could not speak. 7 years together. 3 years married. And it all came down to this moment. The man she loved standing across from her like a stranger. She slowly wiped a tear from her cheek. Then she nodded. "Okay," she said quietly. Alessandro's shoulders relaxed slightly. "I'll take care of it." Relief crossed his face. He reached for her hand briefly, squeezing it with what he probably believed was reassurance. "Thank you for understanding," he said. Understanding, Isabella felt something inside her break completely. That night, Alessandro slept peacefully beside her. But Isabella lay awake in the darkness, one hand resting gently on her stomach, listening to the rain, thinking about the tiny life growing inside her, thinking about the man sleeping beside her who had asked her to destroy it. And sometime, around 3 in the morning, Isabella Rossi made a decision. She would tell him the appointment was scheduled. She would let him believe the pregnancy was gone. And then she would disappear from his world forever. Because Don Alessandro Moretti believed the problem would soon be over. But he was wrong. 9 months from now, he would see her again and discover the truth. She had never ended the pregnancy. The divorce papers arrived 3 days later, delivered by a courier who looked too young to understand the weight of what he was handing over. The envelope lay on the kitchen table of the Manhattan penthouse, like a quiet threat, while Isabella Rossi stared at it from across the room, her hand resting unconsciously over her stomach. Outside, the city moved with its usual ruthless energy taxes honking, distant sirens cutting through the morning air, the endless hum of millions of lives colliding together. But inside the penthouse, everything felt eerily still. When she finally opened the envelope, the pages inside were precise, cold, and efficient. Alessandro had wasted no time. The documents cited irreconcilable differences, the language so sterile it might have described the dissolution of a business, partnership rather than a marriage built on years of shared dreams. Isabella read every line slowly, her heart tightening with each word. The settlement was generous, of course. Don Alessandro Moretti was not a man who did anything halfway. The money alone could have bought comfort for the rest of her life. But as she stared at the numbers, she realized how meaningless they felt. Alessandro believed this was mercy, a clean break, a transaction that closed the chapter of their lives the way he closed every other deal, quickly, efficiently, without emotion. What he did not realize was that Isabella had already decided her future the night he demanded she end the pregnancy. The papers shook slightly in her hands as she signed them, her name sliding across the page in careful ink. With that signature, the world believed the marriage between Isabella Rossi and Don Alessandro Moretti was over. What no one knew was that another life had already begun. 2 nights later, she left New York without telling anyone. The city disappeared behind the airplane window as clouds swallowed the skyline, and Isabella watched silently while one chapter of her life faded into distance. She had packed only 2 suitcases clothes, a few photographs, and the ultrasound appointment card she had scheduled that morning. Her father, Marco Rossi, had not asked questions when she called him. He had simply said, "Come home." That was how she found herself stepping onto the quiet streets of a small coastal town in Oregon, a place where the air smelled of salt and pine instead of steel and ambition. Marco's house sat near the edge of the water, a modest wooden structure with peeling paint and wind chimes that whispered softly whenever the ocean breeze passed through. When Isabella arrived at the door, her father opened it before she even knocked, as if he had been standing there waiting. The moment he saw her tear-stained face, the truth settled in his eyes. He wrapped his arms around her without a word, the kind of embrace that belongs to fathers who know their children are hurting, but understand that explanations can come later. For the first time in days, Isabella allowed herself to cry. Weeks passed quietly after that. Isabella found work at a small marketing office downtown. A simple job with ordinary co-workers who had never heard the name Alessandro Moretti and never would. She wore loose sweaters and avoided mirrors when her body began to change. Doctor visits became secret rituals she faced alone. The first time she heard the baby's heartbeat, the sound hit her like a wave of emotion so powerful she had to grip the edge of the examination table to steady herself. Tears ran silently down her cheeks while the rhythmic thumping filled the small room. The doctor smiled gently and told her everything looked healthy. Isabella nodded, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. That tiny heartbeat felt stronger than anything she had ever known. It was proof that despite everything Alessandro had said, despite the fear and the heartbreak and the uncertainty ahead, she had made the right choice. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the country, Don Alessandro Moretti believed the matter was finished. In his world, problems were solved through decisive action. The divorce had been finalized quickly. the lawyers handling every detail with the same ruthless efficiency he expected from his organization. When Isabella disappeared from New York, he assumed she had chosen to start a new life somewhere far away, just as the settlement agreement allowed. In truth, he rarely thought about it anymore. His days were consumed by power struggles within the syndicate, negotiations with rival families, and the endless balancing act required to maintain control of a criminal empire. The council meetings stretched late into the night, the atmosphere thick with cigar smoke and tension. Territory disputes escalated. Alliances shifted. Alessandro's reputation as a leader only grew stronger. Yet sometimes, in the quiet hours of early morning when the city outside his penthouse finally slept, he would stand alone at the window and stare into the darkness with a strange unease he could not quite explain. Something felt unfinished, like a piece of his life had vanished without closure. But Alessandro Moretti had built his empire on discipline. Sentimentality had no place in his world, so he pushed the feeling away and returned his attention to the work that defined him. 9 months passed that way, unnoticed by the man whose life had unknowingly continued growing inside Isabella. By then, her stomach had rounded beautifully beneath her dresses, a clear sign of the child she carried. The small town in Oregon had embraced her quietly, neighbors offering kind smiles and simple gestures of support. Marco spent evenings building a wooden crib in the garage, sanding each piece carefully as if the future of his grandchild depended on it. Isabella would often sit on the porch with a blanket around her shoulders, watching the ocean and feeling the baby move gently beneath her hands. Those moments filled her with a fierce sense of purpose. Whatever storms lay ahead, she would face them for her child. But far away in the glittering towers of New York, the man who had once shared her life remained completely unaware that the greatest decision of his life had never actually happened. Don Alessandro Moretti believed the pregnancy had ended months ago. He believed the chapter had closed forever. What he did not know was that fate had been quietly preparing a moment that would shatter everything he thought he understood about power, loss, and the price of a single choice. 9 months after Isabella Rossi disappeared from New York, Don Alessandro Moretti stood at the top of a marble staircase inside the grand ballroom of the Blackstone Hotel in Chicago, surrounded by the most powerful figures in the American underworld. Crystal chandeliers hung above the crowd like frozen lightning, casting a golden glow across tailored suits, diamond watches, and quiet conversations spoken in languages of power. The annual Alliance Summit had drawn representatives from nearly every major criminal family in the country. Deals would be made tonight. Territories would shift. Old grudges would be buried or sharpened into new wars. Alessandro moved through the room with the calm authority of a man who controlled more than half the East Coast's operations. When he entered spaces like this, conversations lowered automatically. Rivals watched him carefully. Allies stepped closer. His reputation had only grown since the divorce. The Moretti syndicate had expanded its reach across 2 additional states in the last year, and Alessandro himself had become a name spoken with both respect and caution. By every measure that mattered in his world, he had never been more successful. Yet despite the victory surrounding him tonight, a strange emptiness lingered somewhere deep in his chest, a feeling he had long ago learned to ignore. His consigliere, Matteo Ricci, stood beside him reviewing a list of meetings scheduled for the evening when Alessandro excused himself and stepped out of the ballroom into the quieter marble corridor that led toward the hotel lobby. The hallway buzzed with a different kind of activity, filled with assistants carrying documents, hotel staff arranging coffee stations, and smaller groups of businessmen holding tense side negotiations. Alessandro loosened the top button of his shirt slightly as he walked, the sound of polished shoes echoing softly against the marble floor. For a brief moment he allowed himself a rare pause, leaning against one of the tall columns near the entrance while checking messages on his phone. That was when he saw her. At first his mind refused to recognize the figure standing near the registration desk across the lobby. The woman wore a simple navy blue dress, her dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail that rested against her neck. She was laughing quietly at something a man beside her had said, the sound faint but unmistakable even across the distance. Alessandro's breath caught somewhere between his lungs and his throat. Isabella. For a moment the entire lobby seemed to freeze. 9 months had passed since he last saw her. 9 months since she had signed the divorce papers and vanished from his life as completely as if she had dissolved into thin air. He had assumed she had moved on, started over somewhere far away. But there she was, alive and real, and standing only 20 yards away beneath the bright chandelier light. His heartbeat began to accelerate, a strange mix of shock and disbelief flooding through him as memories he had buried months ago suddenly surged back to the surface. And then she shifted slightly, reaching into her bag for something, and the world beneath Alessandro's feet seemed to tilt violently. The curve of her stomach was unmistakable. Isabella was heavily pregnant. The loose fabric of her dress could not hide it, nor did it attempt to. Her belly was full and round, the unmistakable shape of a woman nearing the end of pregnancy. For several seconds, Alessandro could not move. His mind struggled to process what his eyes were seeing, replaying the image again and again as if repetition might somehow change the outcome. She had told him she would take care of it. She had promised the pregnancy would be handled. Yet here she stood in front of him carrying a child that should not exist. A cold shock spread through his body, replacing the calm control he had spent years perfecting. His hand tightened instinctively against the marble column beside him as a terrible realization crashed through his mind with devastating clarity. The timing was impossible to miscalculate. 9 months. The same 9 months since she had left New York. The same 9 months since the divorce. Isabella had never ended the pregnancy. She had taken his ultimatum, signed the papers, and disappeared with his child growing inside her. Alessandro felt the air leave his lungs in a slow, stunned breath. Around him the lobby continued moving normally, people talking and walking and laughing without realizing that something monumental had just shifted inside the most feared man in the room. For the first time in years, Don Alessandro Moretti felt completely powerless. Across the lobby, Isabella finished her conversation and turned toward the exit, one hand resting unconsciously against the side of her belly in the protective gesture expectant mothers make without thinking. Alessandro pushed himself away from the column and stepped forward through the crowd, his focus narrowing until nothing else in the world existed except the woman walking toward the glass doors. Every step he took felt heavier than the last, his thoughts racing faster than his body could move. Questions collided violently in his mind. Why had she lied? Why had she kept the child? Why had she never told him? But beneath those questions lay a deeper truth he was only beginning to understand. Somewhere in the last 9 months, Isabella had made a choice that defied everything he believed about control and power. She had chosen the child instead of him. By the time Alessandro reached the registration desk, however, she was already gone. The glass doors at the end of the lobby closed quietly behind her, leaving him standing alone among strangers while the weight of the truth settled over him like a crushing storm. Don Alessandro Moretti, ruler of one of the most powerful criminal empires in the country, had just discovered that the life he ordered destroyed had survived without his permission. And somewhere out there in the world, a child carrying his blood was about to be born. The glass doors of the hotel closed softly behind Isabella, but the sound echoed in Alessandro Moretti's mind like a gunshot. For several seconds he remained frozen in the center of the marble lobby, the noise of the conference swirling around him while the truth he had just discovered settled slowly and brutally into place. Isabella was pregnant. Not recently pregnant, not hiding the early signs of it. She was far along, the unmistakable curve of her body telling a story that could not be misinterpreted. The timeline aligned too perfectly to ignore. 9 months since she had signed the divorce papers. 9 months since she had walked out of his life with quiet dignity and disappeared from the world he controlled. And 9 months since he had believed the problem the pregnancy he had demanded she terminate was gone forever. The realization struck him with a force that stole the air from his lungs. She had never ended the pregnancy. She had taken his ultimatum, allowed him to believe the child was gone, and vanished while carrying his heir somewhere beyond the reach of the empire he had built. Alessandro moved suddenly, pushing through the crowd toward the doors she had just exited, his normally precise composure replaced by something dangerously close to panic. The Chicago night greeted him with cold wind and distant traffic as he stepped onto the sidewalk, his eyes scanning the busy street for any sign of her. Cars passed beneath glowing streetlights, their engines humming through the wet pavement after an earlier rainstorm, but Isabella was nowhere to be seen. She had disappeared again, just as completely as she had 9 months earlier. Alessandro stood there for a long moment, his chest rising and falling slowly as the enormity of what he had just witnessed began to unravel the carefully controlled order of his thoughts. For years he had ruled through logic and discipline, believing every problem could be solved through calculation and strength. Yet this situation had slipped beyond his control entirely. Isabella had made a decision that bypassed his authority, defied his command, and reshaped the future without asking his permission. Somewhere in the world, his child was about to be born, and he had not even known the pregnancy still existed. He returned to his hotel suite later that night, ignoring the dozens of messages waiting from council members and rival leaders, who expected him to attend the final negotiations of the summit. The luxurious room felt strangely suffocating as he stepped inside, the tall windows overlooking Chicago's skyline offering no comfort. Alessandro removed his jacket slowly and poured himself a glass of bourbon, but the familiar burn of alcohol did nothing to steady the storm building inside his mind. Instead, his thoughts replayed the image from the lobby over and over again. Isabella laughing softly, her hand resting protectively over the life growing inside her. The gesture had looked so natural, so instinctive, and it triggered a feeling in Alessandro that he had not allowed himself to experience in years. Regret, a deep, gnawing regret that spread through his chest like poison. He remembered the night she had told him she was pregnant, the rain against the windows, the quiet desperation in her voice, and the ultimatum he had delivered with ruthless certainty. At the time, it had seemed like a necessary decision. In the world he ruled, enemies did not hesitate to exploit weakness. Families were targets, children bargaining chips in wars fought behind closed doors. An heir would have been the greatest vulnerability he could possibly create. But standing in that Chicago lobby tonight, watching Isabella carry the child he had demanded she destroy, Alessandro realized something that shook the foundations of everything he believed about power. The greatest weakness in his life had never been the existence of a child. It had been the moment he chose ambition over love. By the time dawn approached, Alessandro had not slept. The city outside his window slowly shifted from darkness to grey morning light, while he stood silently staring at the skyline, his mind finally arriving at a conclusion he could no longer ignore. The past could not be undone. He could not erase the words he had spoken or the pain he had caused. But one truth remained undeniable. Isabella was carrying his child, and somewhere within the next few weeks that child would enter the world. The thought sent a strange mixture of fear and determination through him. Alessandro Moretti had built his empire by refusing to abandon anything that belonged to him. And whether Isabella wanted to admit it or not, that child carried his blood. He walked back toward the table where his phone rested and picked it up slowly, dialing a number that almost no one else in the world possessed. When Matteo Ricci answered on the other end, Alessandro's voice was calm again, but the steel inside it carried a new purpose. "Find her," he said quietly. "I want to know where Isabella Rossi is living, who she's with, and how close she is to giving birth." Matteo hesitated only briefly before responding, understanding that the order carried the same urgency as any war strategy the Don had ever issued. Alessandro ended the call and looked out at the rising sun, the weight of the coming storm settling across his shoulders. For 9 months he had believed the story was over. Now he understood it had only been waiting for the moment when truth would force him to face the consequences of his choice. And this time, no amount of power would allow him to walk away from what he had done. For the first time in years, Don Alessandro Moretti felt the slow, suffocating weight of waiting. It was a feeling he had almost forgotten existed. In his world, information arrived quickly because he demanded it. Problems were solved immediately because he had the power to solve them. But this time was different. This time, the answer he needed was tied to a woman who had already proven she could disappear beyond his reach. The Chicago hotel suite felt smaller with every passing hour as Alessandro paced the polished floor, his mind replaying the image of Isabella in the lobby again and again. The curve of her stomach had been unmistakable, the quiet confidence in the way she carried herself even more so. She had not looked frightened or desperate. She had looked calm, alive, happy in a way he had not seen in her face during the final months of their marriage. That realization unsettled him more than anything else. It meant she had rebuilt a life without him. A life where the man who once controlled every part of her future no longer mattered. Alessandro stopped beside the window and stared down at the Chicago streets below, his jaw tightening slightly as the city moved beneath him like a living machine. Somewhere out there was the answer to the question that had begun tearing through his mind like a storm. Where had she gone, and why had she chosen to keep his child without telling him? The answer arrived 20 hours later. Matteo Ricci entered Alessandro's office in the Chicago suite with the quiet professionalism that had made him the most trusted consigliere in the Moretti organization. Matteo carried a thin black folder in his hand, but the look in his eyes already told Alessandro that the search had been successful. Alessandro did not sit. He remained standing behind the desk, arms crossed, watching Matteo with the same controlled intensity he used when interrogating rivals. Matteo placed the folder down carefully and opened it, revealing photographs and documents clipped neatly together. "We found her faster than expected," Matteo said calmly. "She didn't hide as well as she thought she did." Alessandro stepped closer to the desk and looked down at the photograph on top of the file. The image had clearly been taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. Isabella walked along a quiet street lined with tall pine trees, one hand resting gently over the round curve of her stomach as she moved beneath the soft grey sky of what appeared to be a coastal town. Her expression was peaceful, almost serene, and the sight of it stirred something deep inside Alessandro's chest. He had spent months believing she had erased the pregnancy. Now he was staring at proof that she had chosen a completely different future without him. "Where is this?" Alessandro asked quietly, though the tension in his voice was impossible to miss. Matteo flipped the next page in the file. Portland, Oregon. Small coastal community about 40 minutes outside the city.
If you enjoyed this story and want to watch the full version, you can continue it on my Patreon. On Patreon, you will find the complete story and many more exclusive stories, including alpha, mafia, and romance dramas. If you love deep emotional stories, powerful characters, and dramatic relationships, Patreon is where I share the full experience. Visit my Patreon to unlock the full story and support the channel. The Patreon link is available in the video description below.